Benvinguts a aquesta cerimònia d'inauguració dels Màsters del Departament. Esperarem 2 minuts a veure si venen alguns estudiants més. Bienvenidos a la ceremonia de inauguración de los programas de máster del curso 23-24. Vamos a esperar 2 minutos más para ver si llegan todavía algunos estudiantes o profesores del departamento. Okay? Welcome to this opening ceremony for the master's programs for the academic year 23-24. We're waiting maybe for 2 more minutes to see if any more students and maybe faculty are coming, and then I will say a few words and I will introduce Professor Ana Rojo, who will deliver the opening lecture. Okay? Molt bé. El Departament de Traducció i Ciències del Llenguatge ofereix 4 màsters, coordina 4 màsters, que tenen una població, un estudiantat molt divers, en països de procedència, en titulacions de procedència, i aquesta diversitat ens fa molt orgullosos i és un repte per nosaltres. El primer aspecte en què hi ha diversitat és la diversitat lingüística i, per tant, en les cerimònies sempre començo adreçant unes paraules en català als assistents, després dic també algunes paraules en castellà i finalment saludo en anglès i la conferència inaugural l'oferim en anglès. D'acord? Ara passaré a l'espanyol. En el departamento nos sentimos muy orgullosos de tener una diversidad de estudiantes, diversidad de procedencias académicas y de procedencias geográficas. Y una de las consecuencias de la diversidad es también la diversidad lingüística. Entonces, a mí como directora del departamento me gusta dar la bienvenida, primero en la lengua propia de Cataluña, después saludar en la lengua española y finalmente saludar en inglés, atendiendo al hecho de que en algunos másteres los estudiantes dominan sobre todo la lengua inglesa. Muy bien, ahora voy a pasar a inglés. Okay. Yeah, it's quite an exercise. Cognitive, it keeps you alert. Welcome everybody. I was saying that we are proud of our diversity. We offer 4 master's programs at the department. We work very hard to have everything well organized, and we have the coordinators of the master's programs. We also have the administrative service. We have all our lecturers ready. And one of our features, I think, is the way we meet the challenge of diversity. Diversity of academic backgrounds and diversity also of geographic background. And part of that diversity and the challenges of diversity is language diversity. And in my role as a department chair, I like always to welcome people in our own languages, the Catalan languages, which is the language of Catalonia, Spanish language, the language of Spain, and also English, because I know that many of you primarily communicate in English. I encourage you to brush up on your Spanish, to give it a try with Catalan. We have a Catalan landing program, and to take the chance of living fully a Barcelona life, and that includes not just enjoying the wonderful architecture and culture, and of course the sea and the climate, but also trying to understand the cultural and sociological temperature of Catalonia and of Barcelona. So as I said, we work very hard to have everything ready by the time you come here. And as part of our process, we have two ceremonies, a little bit formal, as you can see. One is the opening ceremony, where we have an opening lecture, which is delivered by I would say an eminent scholar, somebody who is active. We always invite people who are at the top of their careers, and I will introduce Dr. Ana Rojo in a minute. And the exit ceremony is a celebration of graduation ceremony, and that is in July. Between this opening ceremony and the closing ceremony, I wish you, a very successful stay. I hope that you find fine colleagues to work with. I hope that you can learn to collaborate, not only to compete, which is part of the academic reality, but also to find colleagues that will maybe be with you for the rest of your professional career. But also I hope that you find good, good friends and people that will be meaningful to you for the rest of your life. So I think we're all here because we're very excited to listen to Dr. Ana María Rojo. She's a full professor at the Universidad de Múrcia, a bit further south, also Mediterranean. Yeah. She comes from translation studies, but she has developed a career that has aimed, I think, to take the best of linguistics and apply it to the study of translation and the translator. If you allow me, I'll just, maybe introduce a little bit of translation studies. In translation studies research, a distinction is made between product-oriented research, that is studying translated works, process-oriented research, the study of the translating process, and hence the translator at work, and also function-oriented research. Then each of these branches employs its own methodologies and has its definition of data and of empiricism. The process-oriented branch relies on an experimental methodology, which renders it close to the cognitive sciences. And that's why I think Dr. Rojo is so appropriate scholar to come and explain what the connection will be in the future, and is now and will be, between the study of translation and the cognitive sciences, which touches those of you who are here for the Masters in linguistics particularly. Okay, Dr. Rojo has worked on different topics, always applying concepts of linguistic theories, as I said, in particular cognitive linguistics, to both the product and the process of translation and interpreting. She has been and is insightful and creative, and that's why I admire her so much. And at the same time, she's capable of finding the right methodologies to test her hypotheses. And that is I think, more difficult and quite unique, you know, being able to find the right methodology to test your hypothesis and to be able to learn about that hypothesis and to find colleagues who will, you know, build a team with you to develop that. Early in her career, I remember she was the main proponent of an application of frame semantics to the analysis of translation decisions regarding culturally specific items. Later, she developed cognitive semantics approaches to the analysis of translators' decisions. I remember excellent work in the semantic field of motion, including fictive motion, metaphor and metonymy, among others. I couldn't, you know, even start to mention the different topics that she has been conducting research on and supervising dissertations, etc. Now, mostly in collaboration with researchers in her lab, she has published in the main journals of the translation studies discipline, Meta, Babel, Perspectives, Target, Translation and Interpreting. Of the linguistics discipline, Journal of Pragmatics, Multilingua, the Spanish Revista Española de Lingüística, Revista Española de Lingüística Aplicada, and I think more remarkably even in the hard science journals like PLOS ONE, Frontiers of Psychology. She has also published dozens of contributions in edited volumes and has edited volumes herself. Her current research interests focus mainly on the role of emotions, creativity, and other personality and individual differences. Her interests also lie within audience reception analysis, which I think is quite pertinent also for translation studies and for discourse studies. I think it is quite pertinent. She's a principal investigator of a project on emotions in translation, and her lab is a member of the thematic network on empirical and experimental research on translation. And furthermore, she finds time and energy to serve her university and university in general. She was until recently deputy director of the International Doctoral School at the University of Múrcia. I think that's a very important service to perform there because doctoral studies are, I think, let's say the source of intellectual renovation for university, and it is essential that doctoral schools are well managed. She serves as coordinator at the panel for linguistics and languages at the Spanish Agency for the Evaluation of Research. Our colleagues here will know very well that agency. She serves in editorial boards of several research journals, and I'm sure that I'm leaving out, you know, many of her merits. We are very grateful, Anna, and honored to have you deliver the opening lecture of our master's programs. And since I will not be using a performative speech act, please give her a round of applause. That will also serve as the opening round of applause for this master's program, okay?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Anna, for your invitation and for your nice introduction. I know that it is almost customary to say one is pleased to be invited and to be in a place like this, but for me it is a real pleasure to be in this university, which for me is a reference for translation and language and linguistic studies. And it is an honor to have the opportunity to open these 4 different masters. I guess I should start by explaining the title of my presentation, which is the relevance of emotion for multilingual mediated communication. And why multilingual mediated communication and not translation, which is actually what I'm going to be talking about? Well, the reason is rather simple. I decided to use this label coined by Ricardo Muñoz a few years ago, just because it is wider and it allows me to encompass activities which are frequently researched within translation and interpreting studies, but that are not such prototypical forms of translation, such as post-editing or audio description, which is another one of my main line of research. So, when I was thinking about how to structure this talk, I had a hard time. I found it difficult because I thought it had to be interesting enough to keep students and teachers with different academic profiles engaged, and it also should be motivating enough to interest or motivate students who are about to enroll in their postgraduate studies. So in the end, I decided I was going to focus on my recent projects on emotion and translation and audio description. But first, I thought it would be interesting, as Anna said, and I had already talked a bit about my past, it would be interesting to see how I got there from a more linguistic background. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to start having a quick look at my previous studies within contrastive cognitive linguistics. Then I will explain why I decided to study emotion and why emotion is interesting for translation and interpreting studies. I will try to provide a working definition as much as I can and speak about some of the theoretical and methodological assumptions that guide my research. I will introduce my 3 research projects in chronological order. The Mozart projects, which are 2, and the Adance project, which is the most recent one. I will very briefly explain the aims, studies, and instruments. And for the first Mozart one, which is for the only project which I have results, okay, I will also summarize the results for you to have an idea of what we know so far. And I will finish with mentioning some future challenges of this research, of the type of research I do, of experimental research. Okay, so when I take a look at the road behind, I can say that my research trip or my research quest has been guided probably by my interest in cognition, okay? Also in language and translation, but mainly in cognition. In fact, my first research steps were directed at exploring or testing the potential of some, but along the way, I had to face some really difficult turning points, right? My first turning point was from cognitive linguistics and a more corpus-based methodology to cognitive translation and interpreting studies and a more experimental methodology, which is what I'm doing now. Okay, so I'll explain how I got there. My first research steps were directed to test the potential of some cognitive linguistic assumptions to explain translation strategies. Okay? First, in my PhD, I focused on the translation of cultural terms. That was my first work. But very soon, I started to focus on the translation of verbs of motion, okay? Verbs of manner, mainly. This is a line of research I carried out with Professor Valenzuela for almost a decade. And during all that time, we studied verbs of motion, verbs of speaking, verbs of perception, even what has been labeled as fictive motion. Fictive motion is when you have a motion verb in an expression, but the movement is metaphorical. Really, there is no real movement of the subject, as when you say the road that goes up to the top of the mountain, okay? In all these studies, I mainly used a corpora-based methodology. I worked with translation corpora, and I had English as a source language and Spanish as a target language. Right. Very soon, I embraced the notion of embodied cognition. As you may know, some of you, embodied cognition postulates that mind and body are firmly connected, to the point that cognition is anchored in bodily processes. In simple terms, what we feel sort of conditions or influences how we think, right? It was then when I started to use conductual and physiological measures as indicators of cognitive and emotional processes. The first study where I used one of those measures was the study I carried out with Professor Valenzuela. And in this one, what we did is we analyzed the translators' eye movements when they were translating a construction, such as the resultative construction in English, that one, he shot the chicken dead, okay? In which you have the subject, the verb, the noun phrase, which is the object, and an adjective that expresses the result. Now, what happens with that construction? That it cannot be literally translated into Spanish, okay? So we compared the eye movements when they were translating that construction and when they were translating the same meaning, okay, in an expression but without the construction, as in he shot the chicken and killed it. What we found is that the eye movements, the parameters for all the eye movements we analyzed were actually higher for the construction, even if the sentences were actually shorter, okay? It was harder to translate. Right, the following study was one in which we focused on the notion of cognitive metaphor. In this one, we wanted to explore what happens when you translate a metaphorical idiomatic idiom of emotion, such as he was burning with anger, right? So what happens when you translate that into Spanish and you lose the metaphor, okay? You paraphrase the meaning, you translate it without the metaphor, as in se enfadó muchísimo. He got very annoyed. Is that the same as when you translate it using an equivalent metaphor in Spanish, as in se lo llevaban los demonios? He was taken by demons, okay? What we did is, in this one, we measure a heart rate, the audience heart rate, okay? And we found that for the emotions of fear and anger, the heart rate was higher for the metaphorical expression and lower for the non-metaphorical. For sadness, the heart rate was lower because it is what happens with sadness. It lowers the heart rate for the metaphorical as compared to the non-metaphorical. For happiness, we didn't get any results because happiness is very hard to elicit in an experimental lab, I'm afraid. And then in this transition phase, stage, I also included one study in which I didn't use physiological measures, but I put it there because we started exploring something which we are still studying, which is the role of individual factors, okay? In this study, we carried it out with translation students, and what we did is we gave them some positive or negative feedback on a translation they did, and then we asked them to do another translation. And then we measured the impact on their translation performance. But we also measure the regulatory role of a more or less resilient personality and a more or less creative personality, okay? These studies were, in fact, a turning point in my career because it was at that time when I decided I wanted to focus on emotions. Right, and the question is, why emotion? Why is emotion interesting for cognitive translation and interpreting studies? Well, I believe that if you are interested in how translation works at the cognitive level, then emotion has to become relevant. Since most recent evidence from psychology and neuroscience claims that cognition and emotion are actually entangled in the brain, okay? They share brain regions and they share brain circuits. To the point, there is evidence now showing that negative affect and cognitive control activate an overlapping region of the brain, okay? Cognitive control is, in fact, involved in many challenges associated with negative affect. If you think about it, that would explain why when you are under distress, your cognitive control becomes affected as well. The truth is that emotion and cognition influence each other. Emotion can actually grab and modulate attention, but attention can also regulate emotion. If you think about it, the most basic strategy to deal with distress is to run away, not to pay attention, right? Okay, emotions are also relevant if you're interested in improving professionals' working conditions. And we know now that emotions affect mental health and performance. Okay, if you are a professional interpreter or you work with interpreting, you know that interpreters are always stressed out. Okay, why? Because interpreting is a very stressful activity, especially simultaneous interpreting, in which you don't really have time to react. And they frequently suffer from stress, anxiety, and even in contexts where they work with victims and sufferers, they can experience more serious conditions such as vicarious trauma. But freelance translators are no exception either, okay? Freelance translators, most of them work at home, alone, and every time you hear more and more voices in the blogs complaining that they suffer from isolation, from stress, and even from what has been called imposter syndrome. You know what imposter syndrome is? Okay. So all these conditions are reported to have a negative effect, okay, in the interpreters and translators' performance. And what can we do about it? Well, from my point of view, I thought, well, if I know more about the role of emotion in translation and interpreting, and I know more about how it can affect their performance, I might be able to do something about it. So this is what I decided. I decided to study emotion. Now, my big first problem, and everyone's problem when you decide to study emotion, is the definition, right? Emotions are incredibly hard to define. Everyone agrees on that, okay? Part of the reason is because they are abstract concepts, and you can't really open them and see what is inside. You can't touch them. In fact, they're so hard to define that Russell and Barrett in 1999 compared the task of defining emotion to that of dissecting an elephant. Okay. They claim that emotion had become a sort of grab bag where different terms are dumped together, like feeling, mood, appraisal, activation, affect, arousal, valence, and they use all of them used rather indistinctively. Okay? Since I'm not an emotion theorist and I don't really have time here, I'm not going to try to provide a detailed definition of this, but I'm trying to talk about some parameters which may help us distinguish them, okay? Right, one is the processes involved in the emotional event. Okay, most theories agree that emotions are complex processes. Let's take a very familiar example of anxiety, something which I'm sure we have all experienced at some time in our lives or careers. Am I right? Okay. So when you experience an emotional event, you have physiological symptoms, okay? If you experience anxiety, you may have palpitations, you may start trembling, you may sweat too much, you may have a nervous tick on your eye, whatever, lots of things. All those physiological symptoms are also known as arousal, activation, and even affect. Okay, then you have the subjective experience of those, okay? The awareness of those and even of the consequences. That has also been labeled as appraisal and feeling. And then you have the conductual, the behavioral processes, those actions that help us cope, as in some people would run away because they can't do anything else, or some people, I don't know, would eat or drink compulsively, right? Now, the main difference among the theories are found regarding what happens first and how many of these processes are necessary to consider we're speaking of an emotional event. Okay? So, in other words, is the physiological response enough? That is, when we only have the physiological symptoms, can we consider we're experiencing an emotion? Or do we also need to have some subjective awareness of it? And what comes first, the physiological or the subjective? Now, the answer to that, I'm afraid, depends on the theory you embrace sometimes, right? Running the risk of oversimplification, I'm going to follow Lindquist et al., and I'm going to locate emotion theories in two big groups, right? Locationist and constructionist, from a psychology and a neuroscience point of view. So, locationist theories, right, very briefly, think that emotions are innate and they are hardwired to parts of our brain, so they are processed in specific parts of our brain, so that emotions such as anger or sadness, okay, would be processed in different parts of the cortex. Disgust would be processed in the insula, and fear in the amygdala, okay? In contrast to this view, constructionist theories claim that emotions are not innate, they are constructed, okay? So they say, what you find in all these areas of the brain is core affect. Now, core affect has to be understood like the raw experience of feeling, is all those sensations that our body experiments as a reaction of our interaction with the environment, and as a result of the brain trying to keep our bodies in a state of balance and efficiency, okay? Now, when something goes perfectly fine, when we feel wonderful, in balance, we don't feel those sensations. We're not aware of them. They still are there, but we don't think about them. But when something happens that alters those sensations, then they are brought to our attention. Then we start noticing, as in when we are hungry or we see a snake. We experience an emotional event, okay? Now, when that happens, suddenly we say, oh, what's happening here? The brain says, what's happening here? And try to construct an explanation, okay, to restore the balance. Now, how does the brain construct the explanation? Well, by using knowledge about the body symptoms, the particular situation, and our past and previous experiences. Now, let me give you an example. When I see a cockroach, okay? If I see a cockroach and I feel like screaming, running away, and I sweat, okay? I would conceptualize all this as an instance of my fear to cockroaches, okay? Why? Because I know that that is how I feel when I see a cockroach. Now that I even know the technical term, I've learned the label, I can speak of katsaridaphobia, which is the fear to cockroaches, okay? Right, this example may be even clearer because it comes from like Lisa Feldman-Parrett's theory of constructed emotion, yeah? From her book, How Emotions Are Made, which is a really nice book. In this example, she explains how she conceptualized an instance of sadness after watching some school shooting episode in the States, okay? So let me read to you because it illustrates very well the procedure. Sadness is something that may occur when certain bodily feelings coincide with terrible loss. Using bits and pieces of past experience, such as my knowledge of shootings and my previous sadness about them, my brain rapidly predicted what my body should do to cope with such tragedy. Its predictions caused my thumping heart, my flushed face, and the knots in my stomach. They directed me to cry, an action that would calm my nervous system, and they made the resulting sensations meaningful as an instance of sadness. Now, The point is, how can this theory help us distinguish between the different emotional phenomena we've seen? Well, from this point of view, we can consider that phenomena such as mood, feeling, or emotion are all manifestations of affect in different degrees of saliency, from non-salient core affect to highly salient emotions, okay? Mood and feeling would be somehow in the middle, being more salient than core affect, but less than emotion, right? Now, there are also other two parameters that help us distinguish between specific emotions and are important to measure emotions. And this is what is important for me from an experimental point of view, okay? These two parameters are valence, or the affective value you assign to the emotion, which ranges from positive to negative, and activation, or arousal, which ranges from low to high, okay? Now, you can use this to distinguish between emotions, because, for instance, if we take two emotions like happiness and content, okay, they both have positive valence, but happiness is high arousal, content is low arousal, okay? When we have, for instance, sadness and anger, they both have a negative valence, but anger is high arousal and sadness is low arousal. Now, from the point of view of methodology and measuring emotions, this is important because if I want to measure activation or arousal, okay, I will mainly use physiological measures, although I can also use some tests that allow me to do that, some self-report tests. But if I'm going to measure valence, I would mainly need a self-report measure, okay? So if you want to measure everything, the best idea is to use both types of measures. Okay, with this in mind, I will introduce you. Hopefully, you will understand a bit better the assumptions of my research projects. I will introduce now. This is my first research project, EMOTRA 1, which started or ranged from 2017 to 2021. EMOTRA, the main assumptions of EMOTRA, and really they are in all my research projects on emotion, the assumptions are that the impact of emotion in translation and understanding translation in a general sense, okay, involves physiological arousal, subjective feeling, translation behavior reflected both in the production and reception of translations, and that means that I'm going to use the following measures. I will use physiological indicators to measure arousal, self-report measures to measure subjective feeling. I'm also going to use translation performance assessment, okay, to measure translation behavior. Right. As for the general aims of EMOTRA, the general aim was to study the impact of emotions on the translation process and product. And the novelty was that we intended to do that from an interdisciplinary perspective. And we were, and we still are, a team with translation scholars, interpreting scholars, and psychologists. So we work all the time with psychologists in our projects, okay? Right, then it had a more general aim that attempted to define the effects of different valence emotions on the process, product, and reception of translation, and a more secondary one exploring the role of individual and cultural differences. And to finish all this, we produced a protocol, which is actually in our webpage, in which you can find, well, it's very simple, but we just attempted to provide tips that could be useful for students and for professionals, you know, to deal with the effect of emotions. Okay. EMOTRA was a very ambitious project. I don't know how I didn't die in the attempt to finish it, and how I felt like asking for another one. We had 12 different studies with the following participants, for you to have an idea. We had 277 translation students, 23 interpreting students, 10 professional post-editors, 95 professionals working in non-governmental organizations, but not interpreters. Now, 35 interpreters working in non-governmental organizations, 180 professional translators, 362 consumers of translated products, and 84 visually impaired people, consumers of audio description. In total, a bit more than 1,000 participants. We are most grateful too, because without them, nothing would have been possible, really. Okay, regarding the instruments we used, for you to have an idea of what we did, we used the salivates to measure salivary cortisol. Okay, the salivate is what you see there. It's a tube, small tube with a cotton swab inside. Now, to collect salivary cortisol, the participant has to take the swab out of the tube without touching it, ideally, put it in the mouth, move it around for 2 minutes without chewing it, that's important, and then put it back there. Then after that, we freeze it to a very, very low temperature, and then we process the whole thing in the lab. And I did process it. No, we actually, the same members of our team, had to go to the lab to do this. Okay. Then we used a wristband with a chest band also to measure heart rate and heart rate variability. We used a program, a free software program, this time the Open Sesame, to measure reaction time. We bought this face reader, which is a program which analyzes facial expressions as indicators of emotions. We used also, for interpreting, a program that records your voice and then allows you to analyze voice parameters, the PRAT. And for one of the PhDs on post-editing, we use an eye tracker. Okay? Then for self-report data, well, we use different tests. I'm not going to go into detail. Depending on the emotion and the personality trait we wanted to study, we, for instance, look at anxiety, positive and negative affectivity, self-esteem, things like that. Okay, the results of EMOTRA disseminated in over 21 more or less publications, okay, high impact. And don't worry, I'm not going to show you the 21 publications because we don't have time, but I'm going to summarize the results, okay, the methodology and results of 7 of them, which are the most representative, for you to have an idea of the results of the project. So I'm going to summarize 5 on written translation, 1 on interpreting, and 1 on audio description, okay? Right. Here we go. These are the ones on written translation. First, I will explain the research questions and measures to have an idea of the design, and then I will summarize the results. If you have any doubt later about any specific study, you can ask. Right, the first thing we did is we replicated the study we had done with the translation feedback, if you remember, okay, giving them a positive or negative translation feedback, but we did it the first time with translation students, and now we replicate it with professional students, okay? But we did exactly the same. We asked them to translate one test, we gave them positive or negative feedback, and they had to translate a second test. And then we measured the regulatory role of resiliency and creativity. Right, I'll tell you the results of this later, okay, in a few minutes. Right, then we have a study which is very interesting on the effects of emotional congruence and incongruence between the emotions elicited by ambient music and the emotions elicited by the text. In other words, is it the same when you are translating a sad text while listening to sad music than if you translate the sad text while listening to happy music? Do you think so? Well, we'll see the results later. Okay, we had a study also on the independence of Catalonia. Okay, we wanted to explore the effects of a congruence between students' translators' beliefs and a text ideologically laden. And because Catalonia's independence was a big issue at the time, we decided to use headlines on Catalonia's independence. To do this, as you would imagine, we had to come to Barcelona. That was an excuse, actually, to come here. We went to La Autónoma, okay, to the Universidad Autónoma de Barcelona, and we used the students there. In this study, we used reaction time, okay? We measured the time they took to find a translation. And since, unfortunately, we all had to suffer the confinement, but we had to do it during the research project, and we couldn't do anything in the lab, we decided to take advantage of the situation, and we ran a study on the COVID-19 pandemic, okay, without physiological measures. But what we did is we designed two different versions, one with a more positive framing of the pandemic and one with a more negative framing, okay, and compared the effects on students' levels of affectivity and also on their translation performance. Okay. And then our last study on written translation actually measured the effects, something which is very common for translators when they work, the effects of time pressure on translation, okay? For this, we had 3 different conditions, one without any time limit, and 2 with time limits, one more strict than another. And we analyzed the cortisol levels, okay? And we also measure the regulatory role of self-esteem, of a personality trait, okay? I'll explain to you now later the results. Then we had one study on interpreting, measuring the effects of telephone interpreting, in fact, on a student's anxiety and performance. For this, we used heart rate, and we also use the Pratt voice analysis, so, and also the final performance. And this is one of our studies. We had a study on audio-described porn, okay? So we actually explore whether audio-described porn produces a similar emotional input to audiovisual porn. Actually, I'm saying it's one of our studies because we got interviewed by the BBC on this. They were very interested, in fact. For this, we used the salivary cortisol, we used heart rate, and several self-report measures. Okay. Right. Now let me briefly summarize you the results of all these studies for you to see what we know. Okay, we know so far, or we think we know, that variance, okay, influences attention and processing styles. This is something which had been claimed before by scholars like Caroline Lehr, and our results agree with hers. We found that positive emotion, okay, lead to more creative translations. And this is why? Because positive emotions widen the scopus of attention and foster creative thinking, okay, and flexible thinking. That doesn't mean that they're good to prevent mistakes. Unfortunately, positive emotions do not necessarily prevent mistakes. Why? Probably because they have this thing, they limit their motivation to spend too much effort. So they've got this thing, right? In contrast, negative emotions lead to greater precision and less grammatical and spelling mistakes. Why? Because they narrow the focus of attention and foster analytic thinking. It is very important that you bear in mind that this happens when they are not very negative. If they are too negative, then there is no solution there, okay? But if they are not very negative, actually they may increase motivation to correct behavior, okay? We also found that expertise matters, since our students reacted better to positive feedback and professionals reacted better to negative feedback. Now, that was really surprising for us, so what we did, we asked the professionals, and they said that they didn't really actually felt the negative feedback so negative because they were actually used to receive negative feedback from the employers. And some of them worked for like publishing houses, so they were completely used to it. Okay. Now, we found also that valence conditions affective state and strategic behavior, okay? In our study on the COVID-19, we found that after reading the text with a negative framing, with a negative value, students showed higher levels of negative affect than after reading the one with the positive framing, okay? And what we found also is that when they were working with a negative framing, they felt more prone, or they had a greater tendency to alter the source text content. That is, they made more changes, okay, whether mitigating or emphasizing the content. We also found, that was interesting in the study with the music, that congruence between ambient music and source text also leads to more creative translations, even with negative emotions. Now, that was strange, because if you remember, it was positive emotions, the ones that foster creativity. But in this case, we found that result even for negative emotions. However, there is also evidence in the literature saying that apparently congruency generates a general positive effect that overrides that of the specific valence of the emotion and generates the same widening of attention and fosters creative and flexible thinking in the end. Okay, our study on ideology showed that congruence between the ideological content of the source text and that of the student translator's beliefs actually conditions reaction time. Students were faster when the content was congruent with their beliefs and slower when incongruent. But there were also variations between the time they took to understand the source text and the time they took to produce the translation, okay? So what we found is that in our study on the Catalonia's independence, they actually took longer reading. Under the congruence condition, they took longer understanding the source text. And we believe that is because they felt the headlines as more relevant and attracted more their attention. Okay. The study on time pressure showed, of course, that time pressure actually affected the levels of stress and anxiety and translation performance. So participants with higher levels of state anxiety is the anxiety they were experiencing at that particular time, okay? They were more nervous, translated less words, and obviously made more mistakes, okay? But we found two personality traits that play a role there, okay? Self-esteem and trait anxiety. What happened was students with higher levels of self-esteem, okay, possibly led by excessive overconfidence, okay, attempted to translate more words. They thought, oh yes, I can, I'll try, it doesn't matter. So they attempted to translate more words, but also made more mistakes. In contrast, participants with had higher levels of trait anxiety, that is the anxiety that is part of your personality, okay? They were more cautious. They prefer not to translate so many words, but they actually made less mistakes also, okay? This is a very, well, for us it was a very interesting result on sustained attention of concentration, because I study on the COVID-19, okay, showed that the levels of affect, negative affects and positive, were actually higher after reading the source text, but the effect disappeared once they started translating, okay? So it seems that when they read the text, they got the effect, but then once they focus on the task, okay, they concentrate on the task, the main aim is to perform well, and that sort of overcomes the emotional effect, And that is one of the problems we were having. Regarding the study on interpreting, we found that interpreting was stressful, of course, but the higher level of stress was only correlated with more mistakes and more variations in the voice when they were interpreting into the L2, not when they were interpreting into the L1. Okay, they didn't have any problems interpreting into the L1. It was only when interpreting into the L2, which seems that language competence actually mediates the effects of stress on interpreting performance. And finally, our study on audio-described porn showed that the effects were very similar to audiovisual porn, okay? And that is in line with previous results as well, showing that auditory-only information sometimes may lead to a stronger physiological response than audiovisual information, okay? Anyway, since all these results were, at least for us, were very interesting, but we felt it wasn't enough because it was like the problem is there are not many empirical studies on emotion, so that's why we decided to apply for a second project, which is the one we are leading now. For this, we don't have results. I will just show you very briefly. The aims, it's not exactly that, but the aims are very similar. The main difference from EMOTA 1 and EMOTA 2 is that in this one, we attempt to focus more on the effects of cognitive processing, right, on cognitive effort and attention, right, and using eye movements, event-related potentials, and memory tests. Because we felt in our first EMOTA that we were explaining lots of results with attention processes, but we weren't really doing anything to measure attention. And this is what we are trying to do in this second EMOTA project, okay? Since we don't have much time, I don't have to go. I was going to show you, I won't show you this. These are the ones we've done already. But let me pass this. And I'll show you very quickly the ones we are designing now. Only these ones these are some of the ones we are designing for the new EMOTA project. We are designing 2 studies to research the effects of variance of on cognitive processing using an eye tracker, this with and without time pressure. We're having one on audiovisual translation, okay, to research the differences between 2 modalities, subtitling and dubbing, in the emotional reception of video clips. And we are also designing one, exploring the role of directionality in translation, in interpreting, when you are interpreting emotion-laden discourse. We want to try humor this time for a change, you know, like a happy emotion. Right, then we have 5 PhDs. Some of them started with the first EMOTA. I'll show them very quickly to you. They research emotions in different activities. We have Imma, who works with post-editing. Alba García Pedreño works with interpreting in service public, in non-governmental organizations. As you can imagine, she can't use physiological measures. We tried, but there was no way we could use them. We have one on audiobooks. Rosanna, who also researches differences in the emotional impact when you read, or when you listen, as when you read. And this is a new one on the audio-described porn. And this time she is measuring the effect of different styles, because that was when we had the interview with the BBC. They were interested in this sort of thing. And then we have one on written translation and ideology using event-related potentials, okay? Those 5 PhDs. And to finish, we have my last research project, which is the Advanced Research Project. This is a project on audio description, okay? For me, audio description is particularly interesting because it has a great potential to research multimodal communication, and also because it has a great potential for transferring results to society. Also, if I have to be completely honest, another motivation was the need to reduce my research team, which is like too big. I'll show it to you in a bit. So with all these ingredients, I decided to apply, and one of the members of my team is specialized in audio description, Marina Ramos. We decided to apply for this project. And we got it from the Seneca Foundation, which is the agency for science and technology in the region of Múrcia. Okay, so ADANCE is a much smaller project, and the general aim is to investigate the role of audio description in the cognitive and emotional reception of contemporary dance. Okay? We have only 2 experiments, and we want to test a more poetic versus a more neutral audio description, and an audio description produced by a human voice versus an audio description produced by a machine. Okay? The things we want to measure, and we understand for reception, include cognitive effort. We want to measure cardiac deceleration and self-report tests. We want to measure the audience levels of pleasantness using skin conductance and different self-report tests. And also, we will measure the ability to recall details from the audio description, okay? Since our main aim with this project was sort of to foster the audio description of contemporary dance in the region, we had a few tasks prepared to transfer knowledge to professionals and to the general public. So we are going to have a workshop for translation and interpreting professionals, a talk for dancers as well. We're going to have a workshop with visually impaired people so that they can, and dancers together, so they can feel dancers while they are moving, and they can learn more about contemporary dance. And also, is finishing the project will close with an inclusive dance night in which we will provide live audio description. Okay? And now, to finish, just to mention some of the future challenges. This is a bit of a food for thought. We can all think about it. Some future challenges of this result, of my research. Okay, the first challenge relates to translation assessment methods. And this is something which is important for people who study the product as well, okay? I think we need higher uniformity in defining performance measures and scoring parameters. We all need to be measuring the same thing, to do the same, because otherwise we're never going to work in the same direction. For that, we need to increase research transparency and publish our results and procedures and methods in open access repositories. The second challenge is related to experimental procedures. We need to develop and validate stimuli and protocols for eliciting and measuring different emotions. In my case, I need emotional source text and discourses that are comparable for difficulty. This is one of the major problems as well when we research translation, and we need the text to be comparable. We need to work on that. We need video clips validated for emotion of different valence and activation, and even with different audio description styles. And we need that to be available for the research community. The third challenge relates to the bias of the experimental setting. Now, one problem when you work, you do experiments and you place people in a lab is that labs are very stressful, okay? So people start suffering from experimental stress. They become really stressed. And especially if you work with emotion, that is a problem, because that stress may interfere with the actual emotion you want to measure. So what can we do? Well, we need to do something. Obviously, the most obvious thing to do is to make them feel as comfortable as possible, but it's not enough. We need to develop more measures that allow us to collect methods that allow us to collect measures in the real world. You know, platforms that allows us to collect data from home, for instance. That would be really helpful. And finally, the final challenge relates to ethical procedures. We still need to maximize ethical care in emotion research. Another problem we have with emotion is that if you tell your participants what emotion you are researching, you say, look, I'm going to work with sadness. Then it's very likely that they feel prone to say they're experiencing sadness, okay? So you shouldn't tell them about the specific emotion, but you have to tell them enough to make them comfortable and to make sure you're not putting them at any risk, okay? And we need protocols adapted to participants' special needs as well, because sometimes it's hard, to know how to run the whole protocol. And to finish, and now this is to finish, I will show you my team, just for you to see. This is the team in the first Imota team. We were 16 people, and then as you can see, we had translation and interpreting scholars, PhD students, and psychology scholars. From the first Imota to the second, we have only a few changes, one member more, 17. But from that to the advanced team, you can see we're less here, we're only 9 members. We still have translators and interpreters, and we still have psychologists, but we also have dancers and dancers who audio describe, okay, which provide the professional side. And this is all. Thank you very much. Shall I sit or shall I stay here?
No, I think you can stay here
Okay.
at the Atril. We know it's very late, and some of you have courses that start maybe in 10 minutes. There would be time for 1 or 2 questions, if anybody would like to ask a question. Patrick here, anybody else moderating this? No? Patrick Zabalbiascoa from the Masters in Translation Studies.
A couple of questions in detail, one more general. The general one is, how much is all of this specific to translation? And how much would it be, for example, emotion as it relates to work efficiency?
Sorry, how much of this is?
Specific to translation and translators.
Okay.
Or applicable to... And if you have time, I have 2 very short questions. You said that the professional translators react better than the students to negative feedback. React better, what does that mean? Emotionally or in the quality of their translation? In the editing? And the other question is, and that's the end, in the translated headlines for Catalan independence, were they given only the headlines to translate? And were those isolated from the text?
Okay, so the first one is how much of all this is related to translation?
No, related, yes, but exclusive or specific, only translation as a job or as an intellectual endeavor or whatever.
The thing is, I'm not sure whether I could say this is specific to translation, because you see, this is experimental research, and translation, in a way, is my dependent variable. So what I'm doing is, I'm using emotion, okay, as my independent variable to see if it helps me to understand translation better. So if you ask me if all the things I've explained here today about emotion, no, they are from psychology, yes. But then my aim is to apply them to translation, so they help me to understand better how translation processes work. Because I believe that even translation has, for me, a very big linguistic and cultural component. I'm not going to deny that. But for me, that is not the whole picture. If I limit myself to describe the product, we'll probably end up with a very nice picture of what translators do. But for me, there is another cognitive component there. It's like, how do they get there? Because if I don't know how do they get there, if I don't know more about the mechanism, which is really hard, then it's hard to fix something when it goes wrong, or it is hard to try to maximize efficiency, for instance. So for me, the whole picture includes researching or taking concepts from psychology, from linguistics, or from whoever I need to take them, if at the end it's going to help me. Also, I think all this opposition between product and process, you know, that we're all talking about, I've been thinking a lot about this recently, and I think it is really high time we stop that, because if we really and start working together, I mean, not you or not you. I mean that forget the opposition, because we don't really have to be opposed to each other. We don't really should look down on each other. We should work together, because there are some data from the product, you know, that are very useful, and the same, we have data from the process that can really complement each other very nicely. I don't know if that answers your first question. Okay, and your second question was?
The better reaction, what did you mean by better?
Ah, okay. Right, because they actually, they corrected, in the second translation, they corrected, they committed less mistakes. No, they reacted terrible. They got very annoyed. I have to say, they said to me, Anna, I swear I'm not going to do any more translation experiment for you, but the performance was better. And the third one?
The headlines.
The headlines, yeah. The first one was the headlines without a content, but a context, sorry. But that's why I didn't have time, I didn't show it here. But we ran a second one in which we work with whole texts, okay? And in that one, we're measuring facial expressions, because in the end, there were only headlines without context. It was a bit, okay?
Molt bé. So we'll leave it here. Thank you very much for this lecture.
Okay,
I think
been a
it
pleasure.
was, yeah, I think everybody really got thinking there was something for everyone. And our colleagues here, I think they all got pointers to items of their own research that...
Well, you know where I am, so if you need to feel free to write to me if you have any questions or anything.
Okay, so we'll close it here, and I think there's a little bit of aperitiu right outside. So have a very productive academic year, everybody. Adeu.